She had always believed that life had a way of surprising people in the most unexpected ways. For years she had imagined herself falling in love with a man who was bold, confident, and full of words that could charm anyone. She thought love would come in the form of someone who could sweep her off her feet with promises and laughter. But fate chose a very different path for her, one she never thought she would follow. It all began in the marketplace of her town. The marketplace was always noisy. Vendors shouting prices, children running about, women bargaining loudly, and men gathering in groups to talk about the latest news. Among all this noise, she noticed a man who stood apart from the crowd. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't laughing, he wasn't trying to draw attention. He simply moved quietly from stall to stall, picking only what he needed and speaking in the softest voice whenever necessary. At first, she barely paid attention. To her, he seemed ordinary, almost invisible in the sea of people. But then she noticed something strange. While others pushed and argued, he always waited patiently. If someone dropped a bag of fruit, he bent down and helped without hesitation. If an elderly man struggled with heavy sacks, he carried them on his shoulders without being asked. He never asked for thanks, never demanded payment. He simply did what was right, quietly, and walked away. There was something about his silence that caught her attention. It wasn't the silence of a man with nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had chosen to stay quiet, someone who carried his own thoughts deeply inside. She found herself looking for him every time she went to the market. Sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't. But whenever she saw him, her heart grew curious. One day she gathered the courage to speak to him. She expected him to be distant, perhaps even cold. Instead, he greeted her with a polite nod, his words few but respectful. He listened carefully whenever she spoke, and though he didn't reply much, she felt he understood everything. In a world full of noise, his quietness felt like peace. As weeks turned into months, their paths crossed more often. He never made grand gestures, never tried to impress her, but in small moments he showed a kindness that touched her heart. Once, when she slipped on a muddy street, he caught her before she could fall. Another time, when she couldn't carry her baskets home, he walked beside her without saying a word, helping her until she reached her door. Slowly, she began to see what others did not. People often overlooked him, thinking he was too plain, too silent. But to her, his silence was filled with meaning. His actions spoke louder than words, and she began to realize that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't need to shout about their strength. When her family learned of her interest in him, they were surprised. They asked her again and again if she was sure. They reminded her of other men who were wealthier, louder, more powerful. They told her she was choosing a man who seemed to have nothing, no lands, no riches, no reputation. But she stood firm. She told them she didn't want a man of empty promises. She wanted a man whose eyes told the truth, whose hands worked hard, and whose silence carried more honesty than words ever could. Eventually, she married him. Their wedding was simple, nothing like the grand celebrations she had once imagined as a child. But when she stood beside him holding his hand, she felt more secure than she ever had before. He didn't make speeches, he didn't sing her songs, he didn't fill the air with declarations. Instead, he looked at her with steady eyes, and in that gaze she saw a promise stronger than anything words could have given. Their life together began quietly, just like him. He would wake early, do his work without complaint, and return to her with a calm smile. He never boasted about what he had done, never compared himself to others. When neighbors mocked him, calling him too quiet or too plain, he simply let them talk and went on with his life. She noticed how people underestimated him, how they thought he was weak simply because he chose not to raise his voice. But she knew better. She knew the man she married was not weak at all. His strength was in his patience, his ability to remain calm when others were quick to anger. His strength was in his kindness, which never asked for recognition. And though she sometimes wondered what lay hidden in his past, she trusted that when the time was right, he would share it with her. Every evening as they sat together, she often found herself studying him. His silence made her curious, but it never made her feel alone. Instead, it made her want to understand him more deeply. She would ask him questions about his day, and though his answers were short, his eyes always softened when he looked at her. That look, she realized, was his way of speaking, quiet yet full of meaning. In the beginning, she thought she was the one protecting him from the world's judgments, but over time she realized it was the other way around. His calmness was protecting her from the noise, the chaos, the endless expectations people threw at them. With him, life felt simple, safe, and meaningful. She didn't know then that the man she married carried secrets within him. Secrets that would one day shake her world and change everything she thought she knew. For now, she only knew him as the quiet human she loved. The man who asked for nothing but gave her everything in his silence. And though the world might laugh at her choice, she carried no doubts in her heart. She had chosen him, and she would choose him again, because in his quietness she found a strength that no one else could see. Their married life began like the slow rising of the morning sun, calm, steady, and filled with warmth that grew brighter with each passing day. She had once imagined life after marriage would be full of drama and excitement, but with him, it was different. It was not noisy or grand, but it was steady, like a river that flowed without ever stopping. And soon, she began to love this quiet rhythm. Every morning, he woke before her. She would hear the soft sound of water being drawn from the well, the rustle of his footsteps on the ground, and sometimes the quiet humming of a tune that he never finished. When she opened her eyes, he would already be ready for the day, his hands busy with some task. He was not a man who wasted time. To him, each moment had value and he used it wisely. She learned quickly that he had his own way of showing care. He didn't shower her with sweet words or write her poems. Instead, he noticed little things. If she looked tired, he would quietly finish her chores before she could say a word. If she wanted something from the market, he would bring it back, without needing to be reminded. Sometimes he didn't even ask, he just knew. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was awareness. The people around them, however, did not understand. Neighbors often laughed behind their backs. They whispered that she had married a man too plain, a man who had no dreams of greatness. They asked her if she regretted her choice, if she wished she had picked someone more talkative, someone wealthier, someone who could bring attention and admiration. But she always smiled at their words. She didn't need to defend him, because she knew who he truly was. Their opinions mattered little when every evening she sat across from him and saw the peace in his eyes. Her life with him was simple, but within that simplicity, she found joy. She began to notice how much beauty there was in ordinary days. She found happiness in cooking meals and seeing him eat quietly but with gratitude. She enjoyed walking with him to the fields where he worked silently, his hands strong and sure. Sometimes she tried to make him laugh with her words, and though he rarely laughed loudly, a small smile would spread across his face, a smile so rare that she treasured it like a precious jewel. There were moments when she wondered about his past. He never spoke much of it, and whenever she asked, he would give vague answers. It wasn't that he refused. It was more like he carried memories that he had buried deep inside, memories that he was not yet ready to share. She could see it in his eyes sometimes when he stared into the distance as if looking at something far away. His silence in those moments was different, heavier, like a weight pressing down on him. She longed to ask, but she respected his quietness and chose patience. Days turned into months, and slowly their bond grew stronger. She began to understand him without words. When he came home tired, she could tell by the way he moved his shoulders. When he was pleased, she noticed how he lingered a little longer beside her. Love, she realized, didn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it lived in gestures so small that others might miss them, but she never did. She also discovered that his silence was not a barrier, but a shield. It protected them from unnecessary conflicts, from the noise of gossip, from the chaos of the outside world. When neighbors argued loudly over land or money, he stayed calm. When others raised their voices to prove their worth, he remained still. And in that stillness he seemed stronger than all of them. She admired him for this. He was not weak as people thought. He was simply wise enough to know that not every battle was worth fighting. There were evenings when the two of them would sit outside their small home, watching the sky turn from orange to deep blue. She often filled the silence with stories, telling him about her childhood, about the dreams she once had. He listened patiently, his eyes on her face, as though each word she spoke mattered. Sometimes, after she had spoken for a long time, he would finally reply with just a few words. And yet, those few words always carried so much meaning that they stayed with her for days. Though their life was calm, she sometimes felt the sting of other people's judgment. Women her age would boast about their husband's wealth or status, and they would look at her with pity. But what they didn't see was the quiet happiness she carried in her heart. What they didn't understand was that she had chosen not riches, not glory, but peace. And peace, she knew, was something more valuable than gold. She often wondered if the world would ever see what she saw in him. They only saw a quiet man who blended into the background. But she saw someone who carried strength in his silence, someone who could hold her world together without speaking a word. She didn't know then how true her feelings were, how deeply that strength would one day reveal itself. For now she was content simply knowing that he was hers, and that his silence was the safest place she had ever known. Still, there were moments of curiosity that tugged at her heart. She once found him sharpening a blade in the corner of their home. It wasn't a farming tool, nor was it something used in the village. It was a sword, old but polished, its edge gleaming in the sunlight. When she asked about it, he only smiled faintly and said it was from a time long past. He placed it carefully away, as though it carried a story too heavy for now. She felt a shiver, but she didn't press him. She trusted that one day the truth would come when it was meant to. In the meantime, their lives continued quietly. She grew to love the little world they had built together, a world free from loud arguments, free from false promises, free from unnecessary pride. It was a life many would call plain, but to her it was extraordinary, because it was built on something rare: trust, patience, and the kind of love that did not need to shout to be real. And so while others doubted, she lived with certainty. She knew her husband's silence was not emptiness, it was depth, it was mystery, and it was strength that the world had yet to discover. The days of peace had continued for so long that she almost began to believe nothing would ever change. Every morning followed the same soft rhythm, the sound of the well being drawn, the smell of food cooking, the quiet walk to the fields. She loved the ordinary beauty of their life. Yet deep inside, she sometimes wondered why her husband, with all his calm strength, always seemed to be hiding something. His silence was never heavy between them. But there were moments when she felt it carried secrets too deep to be shared. She had grown used to seeing him move like the wind, quiet, unnoticed, but always steady. And then one day the wind stopped feeling safe. It happened in the late afternoon. The marketplace was crowded, and the air was filled with the usual noise of sellers and buyers. She was there with him, carrying baskets of fruit. At first, it seemed like an ordinary day. But then the sound changed. The lively voices turned into worried whispers. The crowd began to shift, and people started stepping back. She turned to see what had caused it, and her heart began to beat faster. A group of strangers had entered the village. They were not from around there. Their clothes were different, their faces sharp with an air of pride. They carried themselves with power as though the ground belonged to them. The villagers looked at one another with unease. No one dared speak loudly anymore. The noise of the market fell into silence, broken only by the stranger's footsteps. She felt her husband's hand on her arm, steady and calm, guiding her to the side. He did not say a word, but the firmness of his touch told her to stay close. She could see the tension in the villagers' faces, the way children were pulled back by their mothers, the way men lowered their eyes instead of meeting the stranger's gaze. Fear spread quietly, but it was clear in every movement. The strangers stopped in the center of the market. Their leader, a tall man with a commanding voice, began speaking. He declared that from now on, the village would no longer be free. Everything, food, animals, crops, would belong to them. The villagers were expected to obey, to hand over what they had, or face punishment. His words carried arrogance, like someone used to being obeyed without question. A heavy silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. The villagers were too afraid to argue, too weak to resist. They had never faced such people before. She looked around and saw despair settling over her neighbors like a shadow. Her husband stood quietly beside her, his face calm as always. But she noticed something different this time. His stillness was not the stillness of patience. It was sharper, heavier. His eyes, usually soft and thoughtful, now carried a depth she had never seen before. She felt a shiver run through her. The leader of the strangers walked closer to the villagers, demanding food and wealth. When no one answered, he laughed coldly. He ordered his men to begin taking whatever they wanted. Panic broke out. Women clutched their children tightly. Men tried to shield their homes, but no one had the courage to step forward. Her heart raced. She held onto her husband's sleeve, thinking he would guide her away, perhaps hide with her until it was over. That was what the quiet man she had married would do, she thought. He would protect her by avoiding danger, by staying silent as always. But then, something changed. He gently placed her hand down from his arm and stepped forward. For the first time since she had known him, he was not simply moving with quiet patience. His steps were deliberate, strong, filled with purpose. The villagers watched in shock as the silent man they had always ignored walked straight toward the center of the market. She felt her breath catch. What was he doing? Why was he stepping into danger? She wanted to call out, to pull him back, but her voice was lost. The villagers whispered among themselves, confused. Some even shook their heads, thinking he had lost his mind. What could a quiet man like him possibly do against such powerful strangers? But as he stood in the middle of the square, facing the intruders, there was something in his presence that silenced even the whispers. He did not speak a single word, yet the air seemed to change around him. His silence was no longer overlooked. It demanded attention. The leader of the strangers turned toward him, surprised. He smirked, as though amused that anyone would dare stand in his way. "And who are you?" he asked mockingly. But her husband did not reply. He stood tall, his eyes steady, his expression calm. The villagers held their breath. They had always thought of him as nothing more than a simple man, someone who worked quietly and blended into the background. But in that moment, something about him felt different. Like the quietness that once seemed ordinary now carried the weight of a storm waiting to break. She clutched her hands together, torn between fear and pride. For years she had loved him for his silence, for his ability to live peacefully without needing to prove anything. But now, as she watched him stand before the strangers without a hint of fear, she realized that perhaps his silence had been hiding something greater all along. The strangers laughed at him, but their laughter did not shake him. His stillness grew heavier, and his hand slowly moved toward something she had never truly noticed before. A long wrapped bundle he always kept close at home, which he had carried with him today. Her heart pounded as realization struck her. It wasn't a farming tool. It wasn't just an ordinary object. It was a sword. And in that moment, she understood. Her husband, the quiet man no one respected, had not always been just a farmer. His silence had been a choice, his plain life a disguise. He had been hiding not weakness but strength far greater than anyone could imagine. The air grew tense. The villagers stared, their mouths open in shock. The strangers' smiles began to fade, sensing something they could not explain. And she stood frozen, her heart filled with a mixture of fear, awe, and an emotion she had never felt so strongly before. Everything she thought she knew about her husband was about to change. The moment felt endless. The villagers stood frozen, the strangers still smirking with arrogance, and she couldn't take her eyes off her husband. He was still silent, as he had always been, But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of a man who avoided trouble. It was the silence of someone who carried power within and was about to release it. His hand moved slowly, carefully toward the bundle he had carried. For years, no one had paid attention to it. They thought it was nothing but farming tools wrapped in cloth. But when his fingers pulled at the fabric, the truth revealed itself. The glint of metal shone under the fading sunlight, sharp and clear. A sword, old yet polished, rested in his hand as though it had always belonged there. The villagers gasped. Whispers rushed through the crowd like a wave. None of them had imagined the quiet man possessed such a weapon. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed. Men who had once mocked him now stared with mouths open. And she felt her heart race so fast she thought it might leap from her chest. Her husband held the sword not like a beginner fumbling with something strange. He held it with ease, with the comfort of someone who had done so 1,000 times before. His grip was steady, his arm firm, his stance strong. In that moment, he was no longer the quiet farmer the world thought him to be. He was something else, entirely. The leader of the strangers let out a mocking laugh. "Do you think you can frighten us with a blade?" he jeered. His men laughed too, but their laughter was less certain now. There was something about the quiet man that unsettled them. He did not reply. He never did. His silence spoke louder than their laughter. He lifted the sword slowly, the steel catching the light. The air seemed to shift, heavy with tension. The villagers could feel it, even the children sensed it. This man was not ordinary. The strangers tried to test him, stepping closer with confidence. But the quiet man moved with a speed and grace that stunned everyone. His body flowed like water, his movements smooth and precise. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. The sword was not raised wildly. It was controlled, balanced, as if guided by years of discipline. The villagers had never seen such skill. Their eyes widened with disbelief. They had thought strength came from loud voices, from bold declarations. But here was a man who had spoken almost nothing in years, and yet his silence carried more power than the loudest shouts. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her hands pressed tightly to her chest, fear, awe, pride, everything mixed together in her heart. The man she had loved for his gentleness was now standing like a shield in front of everyone, his strength shining in every movement. She felt her eyes sting with tears, not of fear, but of overwhelming realization. She had always believed he was special, but she had never imagined this. The fight that followed was not chaotic. It was not wild or noisy. It was controlled, almost graceful. He moved like someone who had long ago mastered the art of balance and timing. Every step, every swing of his sword was measured, deliberate, and precise. The strangers, once confident, began to falter. Their arrogance slipped away as they realized this was not a man to be underestimated. The villagers who had once mocked him now looked at him with wide eyes filled with respect. Children peeked from behind their mothers, whispering in awe. Women held their breaths. Men who had doubted him felt a mixture of shame and admiration. And she could not move. She was rooted to the ground, watching him with her whole heart. Her quiet husband, the man who had been mocked for his silence, was revealing himself as a protector, a guardian, a man who had chosen peace but carried the strength of a warrior. When at last the strangers realized they could not win, they pulled back. The leader's smirk had vanished, replaced with a look of frustration and fear. He called for his men to retreat, and together they left, their pride shattered. The village fell silent again, but this time it was a silence of awe, not fear. Everyone turned their eyes toward him. He stood in the center of the square, breathing calmly, the sword still in his hand. His face remained composed as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He had not shouted, had not boasted, had not even looked for recognition. He had simply done what was needed. Slowly, he lowered the sword, wrapping it again in cloth, and turned back toward her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world disappeared. She saw not just the quiet man she had married, but the truth hidden inside him. He had chosen silence not because he lacked strength, but because he had too much of it. He had chosen peace over conflict, stillness over pride. Her heart swelled with pride and love, so strong she thought she might cry. She realized then that the man she had married was far more than she had ever known, and everything had changed the moment he drew his sword. The village never looked at him the same way again. Before, he had been the man no one noticed, the one people called plain, too quiet, too simple. Now he was the man who had stood against danger when no one else dared to move. Respect replaced. Mockery and admiration filled the air wherever he went. Neighbors who once laughed behind his back now greeted him with bowed heads. Children followed him with shining eyes, whispering stories of how he stood unafraid. Even the elders who had thought him ordinary now spoke of him with reverence. The silence that once made people dismiss him now became the very thing that made them respect him. But he himself did not change. He did not boast. He did not demand thanks. He returned to his quiet life as though nothing had happened. He still woke before dawn, still worked in the fields, still came home with the same calm smile. The villagers may have seen him as a hero now, but to him he was still the same man, silent, steady, and content. She, however, could not see him the same way again. She had always loved him, but now her love was mixed with deep admiration. Each time she looked at him, she remembered the way he had stood in the square, fearless and strong, protecting not only her, but the entire village. She realized that she had married not just a good man, but a man who carried greatness quietly within him. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, she finally asked him the question that had been burning in her heart. "Why do you stay so quiet? Why? Do you hide what you can do?" He was silent for a long moment, as though choosing his words carefully. Then he looked at her with the same calm eyes that had once puzzled her. "Because," he said softly, "the world has enough noise. I wanted to give you peace instead." Her heart trembled at his words. She realized then that his silence was not weakness, it was a gift. He had left behind a life of conflict to create a life of calm for her. His sword, though sharp and ready, was something he hoped he would never need to use again. His quietness was his way of protecting not only himself but also her heart. The village might see him as a hero, but to her, he was more than that. He was her home, her protector, her partner. The man who had shielded her from the storms of life not by shouting or boasting, but by living with calm strength. And though everything had changed the moment he drew his sword, one truth remained unshaken. He was still her quiet husband, the man she had chosen, the man who would forever carry both peace and power in his silence. She leaned against him that night, listening not to words but to the steady beat of his heart. It was enough. It was more than enough. And she knew that no matter what came, she would never regret marrying the quiet man whose silence held the strength of 1,000 voices.